Hey everyone, it's me. And today I'm going to tell you about Chernobyl, the warning that was ignored. It's spring 1986. You are a worker at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. One day you notice something weird going on with the reactor. No, a few days later it explodes. You find yourself stuck in an endless wasteland full of monsters, mutants, and cannibals. What is going on here? Nothing. Just another Tuesday in Pripyat. Am I right? On April 26, 1986, the world's worst nuclear disaster happened at the Chernobyl power plant in northern Ukraine. As of today, it still holds a record for being the only energy reactor disaster to ever receive a level 7 on the International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale, which means it was a serious, severe accident. Because of this accident, over 30 people died. Thousands more were exposed to large amounts of radiation, and thousands of square miles had to be evacuated and remained that way until this very day. But why did this happen? Let's find out. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was built in the 1970s during the Soviet Union era. At the time, nuclear energy was considered one of the greatest achievements of science and technology. It was seen as a great way to help decrease dependence on fossil fuels and reduce pollution. So when the Soviets decided to build a new power plant in the small town of Pripyat, they thought it would be a great idea to have their newest and most advanced reactor model, the RBMK-1000, which stood for reactors with water cooling and moderation, Kanelny Ustava, which is Russian graphite and not uranium. But really, let's be honest, who cares if the water cooling system fails or if the core overheats? This bad boy is going to be fine, right? Right anyways. The plant started operations in 1977, and by 1986, it was producing around 10% of all the electricity needed in the Ukraine. See, the plant was too far from the capital city of Kiev, and it was surrounded by towns and villages. It was also relatively close to the Belarusian border, which is not that big of a deal since these two countries were part of the Soviet Union back then. It was also pretty close to Sweden, but that didn't matter because, well, Sweden doesn't share a border with Ukraine. Anyways, point being, it was nowhere near any major cities, so no one really cared about the nuclear power plant except for the workers and nearby residents. One of these workers was a 29-year-old technician named Anatoly Duk. On April 1986, he began working the night shift along with his co-workers Viktor Brakhanov and Leonid. Their job was to monitor the reactors and make sure everything was running smoothly. So what did they do while on shift? Well, according to some reports, they played cards, drank vodka, and ate sunflower seeds. Not exactly a hard-working bunch. Anyways, at 1:23 a.m., one of the instruments on Reactor 4 showed that the power output had dropped, which is bad because that means the reactor isn't generating enough heat to sustain itself. If that happens, a nuclear reaction slows down and eventually stops, which means the coolant pumps stop working, which means the water starts boiling and then the fuel rods overheat and then there's an explosion. In layman's terms, a meltdown, which we don't want. So the technicians contacted senior officials for instructions. One of them was a 64-year-old chief engineer named Nikolai Fomin. He said to run an emergency test to increase the power output, but this test required the reactor to be reduced to a minimum power output before it could be carried out. This might sound like a simple task, but it was actually so dangerous that there was an entire written procedure for it, and even that wasn't enough. Fomin ordered the test to begin anyways. Now, here's where the story takes a turn. See, the written procedure called for 3 technicians to perform the test, but only 2 technicians were available, Victor and Leonard. And since they didn't have a third person, they split up the tasks between themselves. Now, this is already a problem. According to the official investigation, splitting up the tasks was a violation of safety procedure. But even if they did have a third person, the chances of survival would have been slim to none. And I'll tell you why. See, each technician had to pull on one of 2 control rods. These rods were made of neutron-absorbing material and were used to regulate the nuclear reaction. Each rod had a specific purpose. One rod controlled the power output of the reactor. The other rod was the emergency shutdown rod, and it was specifically designed to stop the nuclear reaction in the event of an emergency. So naturally, the one who was supposed to pull the emergency shutdown rod was the one who was also in charge of monitoring the readings and making sure everything was working properly. But with only 2 people performing the test, this wasn't possible. They tried their best, but in the end, they ended up violating safety procedures left and right just to get the test done as quickly as possible. At one point, one of them had to leave his post just to grab a piece of paper to write down the data. And when they were almost done, one of them forgot to reset his safety mechanism after he was done. When they finally finished the test, the reactor was unstable and was emitting huge amounts of radiation. By now it was 2:30 a.m. and both men were aware that something was wrong, but by this time it was too late. There was no saving the reactor. As the situation rapidly worsened, they sent a message to the firefighters stationed near the plant, warning them that there was a possible hydrogen explosion in the reactor. They responded, saying they would send someone over to check it out, but they never did. By now, the situation was out of control. The reactor was emitting enormous amounts of radiation and the hydrogen was building up inside the containment chamber. Then at 2:59 a.m. it exploded. When the news of the disaster reached higher officials, they immediately tried to cover it up. They didn't want the Soviet Union to look weak and unprepared in the eyes of the world, so they gathered the city's residents and told them there was a fire at the power plant, but that it wasn't anything to worry about. They even went as far as to shut down the city's fire department and rerouted the firefighters to the power plant. Only a handful of firefighters were informed of the true danger they faced, but many of them refused to believe it. They thought it was just another attempt to scare them into doing their jobs. Meanwhile, the disaster was getting worse. The explosion had released huge amounts of radioactive particles into the atmosphere, which spread across Europe. The Soviet government was forced to evacuate the city, but it was too late. Over 600,000 people had been exposed to high levels of radiation. The nearby villages were the most affected, but the radiation spread so far that no one was truly safe. Today, Pripyat is still a ghost town. The buildings are empty and nature has reclaimed the streets, but it's not a safe place to visit. The radiation is still too high for humans to live there. But this disaster had much farther-reaching effects. It caused thousands of cases of cancer and birth defects, and it led to the downfall of the Soviet Union. After the disaster, the Soviet government was in a panic. They didn't know how to fix the damage or how to contain the radiation, so they turned to the United States for help. On May 14, 1986, President Ronald Reagan dispatched a team of scientists and medical experts to help with the crisis. This was during the Cold War, so the Soviets were hesitant at first, but they eventually agreed. The American experts helped set up a command center and coordinate the evacuation efforts. They also helped treat the injured and develop a plan to clean up the mess. In total, the Americans spent over $20 million on the cleanup, and the Soviet Union paid them back with interest. The Soviets realized that they couldn't hide the disaster forever, so they came clean to the rest of the world. They admitted that there had been an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and that it had released radioactive material into the environment. They also admitted that the radiation had spread to other countries, but they claimed that it was under control. They didn't come clean completely. They still tried to downplay the severity of the disaster and protect their own citizens from the truth. But the damage was done. The Soviet Union's reputation was in tatters and its days were numbered. In the years since the disaster, many people have tried to downplay the significance of Chernobyl. They claimed that it wasn't that big of a deal, and that the effects were overblown. But nothing could be further from the truth. Chernobyl was one of the worst disasters of the 20th century, and its effects are still being felt today. Thanks for watching.